Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Harris, and I'll be joined today by, losing my voice already, Michelle Peters and Andrew Wilson, supply chain experts from Supplino. We'll be sharing insights today on the most common operational and legal pitfalls companies encounter when moving out of China. And more importantly, we'll be providing concrete strategies to avoid them. Our agenda for today is on the screen. We've saved the last 15 minutes for Q&A, where we'll answer some of the best pre-submitted questions as well as those that come in live. Our comments chat is closed right now. We will open it up 5 minutes before the Q&A for people to add additional questions. This is me. I am an international lawyer. I started handling mostly China law matters in around 2000, and I launched the China Law blog in 2003. Though my firm still does a lot of China work, we began pivoting away from China in around 2017, and today about half of our manufacturing related work involves countries other than China, primarily Vietnam, Thailand, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-panelists.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle from Supplino. I'm an electrical engineer with a long career in industrial and chemical and manufacturing. Supply chain. My company, Supplino, we are a network of affordable and flexible experts in supply chain that support small and medium-sized businesses. Happy to be here today.
Andrew.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Wilson. I've been, living and working in China for more than 12 years. Have extensive experience in electronics manufacturing, fast-moving consumer goods, automotive, and have been working with Chinese suppliers for 12 years, and excited to be here too.
Thank you. I've actually known Andrew for at least 12 years and worked with him for at least 12 years.
Yeah.
Okay. All three of us on the panel are frequently called in to fix problems that could have been avoided, often at great cost to our clients. Today, our goal is to highlight the 10 most common mistakes we see companies making when shifting their manufacturing out of China, and to share practical steps to help prevent those problems. We've split the top 10 mistakes into two categories: mistakes that happen before leaving China and mistakes that happen during the move. It's especially helpful to address the pre-move mistakes early on, because doing so can much better position you for a smoother, more successful transition. You can see the top 5 pre-move mistakes on your screen now. And I'm going to now turn it over to Andrew and Michelle.
Yeah, so let's start going through these mistakes one at a time with you guys. The first one that we see that is quite common, and especially with the tariff changes that have been happening so rapidly from Washington, is making hasty relocation decisions, reacting to a new tariff announcement or the intent of a tariff announcement. Companies want to move quickly and they're jumping into, okay, I need to relocate. And instead, what we need you to do, and what you should do, is take a step back and view this as a strategic decision, as part of your supply chain decision making, and look at all 3 of these tiers of decisions before you start talking to suppliers or getting quotes from factories. First, think about why you're moving. What is the strategy overall? And that is, what was the strategy before the tariffs? And now with the tariffs, how is that changing? So if you were looking for cost down to begin with, and then the tariffs came and just made it that much worse, then you're staying on a cost reduction strategy, right? And that's why you're moving. If, however, you weren't particularly pressured on cost until the tariffs came, and you make a move that's only cost related, you may find that you're giving up resiliency, you're giving up flexibility and quality by making that cost move. So step back and really think about the purpose of the move, the strategy behind it. When you're then thinking about where you're going to move, and there's a lot of discussion about, like Dan said, which country you go to. Don't be hasty there either. We are seeing a lot of factories from China adjacent countries claiming that they can move your production. And what is really happening is it's just China production that's getting shipped to that country, relabeled illegally, incorrectly with the country label, and then ship it out. And that's not going to last for long. You're going to get caught with that. So think carefully about the place you're going to move. Does it make sense for you in the long term strategically for your client base, for your globalization strategy? And also, does it make sense that this country is claiming that they can do what your Chinese factories can do? And then finally, what to move. Are you going to move your entire SKU portfolio? Are you going to move at a finished goods level, a subassembly level, a components level? That's where supply chain mapping helps. And it doesn't have to be complex, but you need to lay out where does your material come from in the world before you start thinking of moving everything. And with that map, that helps you think through the logic of where does it make sense then to move my production or split into finished good and subassembly between countries. Okay, so overall, this mistake is all about just jumping into moving and getting quotes before thinking it through beforehand.
The only thing I will add to this, and I can add it from a lawyer's perspective, because people come to us so often after they've had problems. But I would say a hasty relocation is by far the most common problem that we see as lawyers. A lot of the other mistakes stem from this. So this is a big one.
Yeah. Can be the most expensive too because of that.
Yes.
Okay. Andrew, you got the next one.
Yeah, certainly. One of the biggest challenges that, I see is that there's a lot of companies that think they can just assume going to a factory in Vietnam or Mexico is a one-to-one replacement. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Chinese industrial zones, they're not just a collection of factories. They're really self-contained ecosystems, in and around the region of Shenzhen, which I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with. They have everything that you would need to build an electronics product within a few dozen miles of each other, right? Anything that breaks down can generally be replaced within a few days or at the most a few weeks, in contrast to other parts of the world where it can take a few weeks at a minimum to several months. So one thing that's really not discussed a lot is that, the level of geographic density is a form of economies of scale in and of itself, right? It powers speed, flexibility, and innovation that you just don't really see in other countries. In my experience, companies that are trying to move out of China, will experience, a couple challenges, higher component costs because a lot of the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are not located within the country. You typically have slower turnaround times on things like tooling, process, or changes or improvements on the manufacturing side, or even MPI work, new product introduction work, can take a lot longer. And finally, we're seeing companies experience longer production lead times, higher MOQs typically, and fewer value-added services, right? So these are all things that you can sort of expect when going abroad, comparing and contrasting against China. So I guess the bottom line is, before you really make and commit to a relocation, really deeply assess the maturity of the full ecosystem that you're going into, right? Not just the factory that you're going to partner with, but include things like logistics, local sourcing depth, any kind of engineering support, and how quickly you can troubleshoot things when they go wrong, right? So to this end, I'd also recommend that you do keep your Chinese supplier around, especially if you're thinking about your global operations and how they can serve, your order and fulfillment operations in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and again, from after the problem perspective, we had a client couple of years ago moved their manufacturing from China to Peru. And they were working with a really excellent Peruvian factory making $2,500 products. And they got those products back to the US, and there were problems with all of them. And it all came down to a $3 spring that the Peruvian factory had locally sourced.
Yeah.
And our client had to order the springs from China, have them flown over, and it was very, very costly because they had to pay for the flight and late charges. And the lesson there is, I guess it's twofold. Don't be hasty, and don't expect an identical factory in your new country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is on me. And this is something we obviously see a lot, and that is people neglecting the legal side of their move from China to somewhere else. And it's a twofold legal issue. It's what do you do with China and what do you do in the new country? Well, when you leave China, the vultures are going to circle. And this love that you felt previously, it is going to disappear completely. Your former factories will hate you. The Chinese government will hate you. Sinosure, the export insurance company, will hate you. All your alleged creditors from years ago, they won't hate you, but they'll come after you. And all this leads to a lot of problems. Your products are all of a sudden way more likely to be copied. Your brand name is way more likely to be taken by others and registered as their own trademarks. And then you've got the dual problem. If your factory takes your products and your trademark, then you're in real trouble. And you could be facing lawsuits or be blocked from recovering your key assets, including, I should say, especially your molds and tooling. And so a lot of times when companies leave China, it is a disaster on the China side. And believe it or not, there is a solution, and it's not that difficult and it's not that expensive. It's preparing before you leave, and most especially preparing before anyone knows you're planning to leave. And on the legal side, this preparation includes what you should have been doing all along, which is making sure that you have good enforceable contracts under Chinese law, making sure that your intellectual property is registered and up to date in China, and dealing with whatever issues you have, outstanding debts in China, employee debts, etc. And then when you move into the new country, the good news is you get to enter with a clean slate, and you now have the opportunity to get things right from the very beginning in this new country. And that starts with strong supplier contracts and robust IP protections. It's basically rinse, wash, repeat.
Okay, the next mistake, and this is a very common one, is document and asset verification. When planning for the move, people say we'll do that during the move. So they build into the project, during the move, we'll check to see where the molds are, we'll check all the tooling, we'll check all the equipment. This is a mistake. You absolutely want to do this before you move, because often what you're going to find is you can't find that tooling, you don't own those molds. And there may be specialized processes and test equipment that you don't even know about that's in the manufacturing process that you cannot move, okay? So be very careful about this. At a previous company I worked at, we actually had to stop a move from a Chinese supplier because even though from our side, we thought we had paid for the molds and we thought we had documented it correctly, we did not. And the Chinese supplier actually wouldn't even let us know where the molds were, so we could verify their existence, right? We knew, of course, we're making the product, they had the molds, but in terms of storing older ones, we didn't know where they were stored. And they wouldn't help us because to them, they didn't consider that we owned them. To them, they were part of their supply chain and their suppliers. So this can have real ramifications. The picture, of course, is an injection mold, but it's more than injection molds, right? It's your setup tooling, it's your testing equipment, it's your entire manufacturing process. And for those of you that are buying somewhat black box, right? You're buying either equipped product or you're buying a subassembly, and you yourself don't know how to manufacture that, your supplier does. You have to be doubly vigilant on this, because if you're going to transfer it, you need to make sure you have some ownership and some knowledge that you're going to transfer to the new supplier, because the old factory is not going to necessarily help you with that. Okay. The other thing to be careful of in this step is your own engineering documents. We worked with a client that had 80% of their engineering documents inaccurate. Okay, 80%. And that meant constant emails with the engineers to clarify, constant corrections and ECOs, engineering change orders on the fly. If you have that kind of process, it is very difficult to transfer. You can imagine the factory will be fine. They will give you all your inaccurate documentation back, but your new factory then has nothing to go on that's accurate. And you need a tremendous amount of engineering talent all of a sudden mid-project to jump in and redesign everything. So the message here is really do this before the move. Do an audit of all your documents, all your processes, and all your tooling and equipment before you decide to initiate any kind of changes or communicate anything.
And on the mold and tooling side, basically, if you do not have a written contract, preferably in Chinese, that makes exceedingly clear that you paid for and own your molds and tooling, the chances of you getting your molds and tooling out are not good. And in my career, I've probably had hundreds of companies come to us wanting to sue to get their molds and tooling back. And we've never accepted a single case, because what's the point in spending $200,000 in a 2-year lawsuit to get molds and tooling back that they could build in 6 months for $200,000? So it's not having a contract is not a good solution.
Yeah. And I would add to Michelle's point, I see a lot of companies that send over the process documentation and how to build it, but it's for it's for prototypes or small batch runs and not good enough for, full scale production. And the factories then have to take that process documentation, transform it, including creating test jigs and other types of equipment to push this through. And you might not know about that. Right. And so you're still working off your initial documentation that you're going to send to the new supplier, and they would have to go ahead and create it for mass production. So that's very important that you understand any kind of process documentation that have changed and be able to get that and know that, as Dan said, if they change that, it's still owned by you. It's still your process.
And would you recommend that they do it? Because on the legal side, I always say, let's get a new contract in place before they know you're leaving. Would you recommend that they get these before? Okay.
Yeah, sure. If you don't have a contract, most certainly. And you'll see where they stand if they, give you any pushback or resistance on certain things in terms of ownership claims within that contract. You can see, are you going to have an easier time or a harder time exiting this factory?
Well, I'm actually asking about things like the engineering drawings, because what you described, I have also seen where the client thinks that they've got up-to-date documents, but really the only company that has the up-to-date documents is their Chinese factory. Mm-hmm. And going back to them after you've set up in Colombia or Mexico is not going to work.
No.
Right. No, and this is typical in a lot of contract manufacturers, not just Chinese contract manufacturers, is that they consider improvements that they've made in your process theirs. Right? That's their value that they're adding with their own engineering team. They're not necessarily going to share that with you. They're not going to give you their work instructions. They're not going to tell you what special sauce their production team has come up with to make the production faster. Right?
Correct.
So you need to go in eyes wide open that what you're changing, what you're switching is not necessarily today's process. You might have to back up into yesterday's process to move and then build that back up with the new plant. Yeah.
Right. And this is sort of the flip side of that. What we often see is someone has decided to move their manufacturing from, let's say, China to Vietnam, and the Chinese factory, it's usually a very high-level Chinese factory, will say, that's fine, but you can't build the same product because we have 2 patents in it. And then our client comes to us and say, well, they can't do that. And it's
Yeah.
like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You were using their patents for the last 10 years. You can't expect them to let you take that for free somewhere else. And they didn't even know that they were doing it. So they didn't really know what they were making.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's good to know before you move.
Can
All
you
right.
go back, Dan?
Well, yeah, go back.
Oh, sorry.
Go back one. Go back to 5 there.
Here we go.
There we go. All right. Last point on before the move is for those of you that have been hiring, you probably know how tough it is to hire supply chain people with project management experience right now. We're in a supply chain talent shortage. And what that means is most supply chain teams are overburdened already dealing with your day-to-day customer issues and all the stuff that is needed to get product out the door. A relocation project is not a minor effort, okay? Please do not, and this is the mistake, just push it on to your already overburdened team as one extra thing that they have to manage, all right? What will happen if you do this, and we see this a lot, is that they will do the minimum necessary to get the relocation done. And what that means is they're not really checking on risks. They're making fast, not optimal decisions. They are not anticipating problems. They're just doing the minimum necessary to get it done. And this is really problematic and will lead to running into all the problems that we're talking about in the other things here. So best practice here on a reshoring move is really to carve out time, if you have the bandwidth, on one of your people and give them 20% of their time, 30% of their time. They are focused on this project for that. It doesn't have to necessarily be 100% of their time, but a day a week that they do nothing but this, they focus, okay? If you do not have that kind of bandwidth in your team, use externals to come in and help run that project. This is what we have at Supplino in the many consultants that we have. We have people that do reshoring all the time. They can help your team. You don't have to use us, use somebody else, but make sure that you have the proper amount of focus on this project so that things don't derail and you have to pay for that 5, 6, 10, 20 times over later, unwinding problems that could have been avoided. Okay.
Yeah. I would add a story to this. You know, I worked at a company where they were just trying to move a factory a mile down the road and using the existing team to do it.
Yeah.
And, it was over budget and, over time by over 8 months. And this is just a mile down the road.
Yeah.
Right? And, if so, I couldn't even imagine what it would be working with factory 6,000 miles away and trying to relocate that to a factory 1,500 miles away, 2 different cultures, 2 different systems, 2 different ecosystems and supply chains. Existing team members will have a hard time doing that, especially if they don't have the experience and knowledge about all the different risks that can pop up during that process.
Okay, now we're turning to the top 5 mistakes we see during the move. These are the things you need to watch out for once the move has begun.
Okay, and first one here is, even if you have a person that you've assigned to it, often what companies will say is, great, Michelle, you're assigned to this relocation, go. And leaders will often say, Michelle, if you have a problem, come talk to me. Otherwise, it's all yours, right? For a project with this level of complexity and this level of risk and cost to you as a business, don't skip formal project management. And what I mean by formal project management is a couple of things. I mean, have an executive leader be the sponsor or executive champion of the project. There needs to be somebody in leadership that can swoop in and help the team make decisions or help get roadblocks out of their way when needed quickly, okay? 2, there needs to be a formal project plan. This is not something that you just want to trust someone to figure out. You want to see, what are the milestones? What kind of budget do we have in place for this? What kind of timeline have we committed to? And you want a regular review of that project with that team, all right? Speaking of the team, This is often, unless you are a really tiny team, this often needs to be cross-functional. And so we're talking about involving not full-time, but having on the team as helping the decisions, your quality people, often your sales people or whoever's doing your demand forecasting to make sure that there's enough lead time and coverage for customers so that you don't stock out during this period of transition, right? And then finally, you need to review the project as it's going in a formal way, monthly, bi-weekly, weekly, depending on how urgent the project is. But don't let your lead people just go and then you only hear when there are problems with the project. Really make sure that this project is moving smoothly.
It's interesting that you talk about that because I used to have a slide in one of my talks, which is get an expert, be an expert. And literally just this morning, I had a client send me a contract between his company and a Cambodian factory and say it was a contract we had drafted years ago. And he said, would you please put in here that if they don't meet the standard timeline, that they're going to have to airship the product? And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know what he means by standard timeline regarding his widgets in Cambodia. So I wrote him back and I said, what do you mean? I mean, what's the timeline that works for you and would be realistic for the factory? And he immediately came back with a perfect timeline. And I thought it was interesting that he hadn't done it in the first place. And very smart person, but people sometimes abandon their own role when they've brought on experts. And you shouldn't do that because nobody knows your company better than you do. No outsider ever can. And so you need to stay involved.
Yeah. All right. One thing that we find is that a lot of companies maybe cut ties too early before the new factory is up and running or the new products have been tested, only for them to return really hat in hand. To ensure they don't run out of product, right? Or to get a quality product because the first runs with the new factory were not good. And, this forces them to lose a lot of leverage and goodwill that they had with that supplier. And, in order to get around that, there's three things that I would, really think about. One is maintaining open communication with your supplier about any changes to order quantities or requests for information during this period, because there likely will be some questions that you maybe didn't ask the supplier previously when you're trying to move your product away from them. So make sure you have answers prepared for that in advance, right? And you're not informing them if you're not informing them about the move. If you are, that's a different discussion. But and ensuring your comms are consistent across your stakeholders so that the stories don't get mixed up, right? The next thing is maintain continuity. I can't stress this enough. Do not leave a current reliable supplier until the new supplier has proven reliable and consistent in terms of their quality. I would say, you want to do a gradual ramp down, ideally 12 to 18 months. Once the new supplier has proven reliable, not once you get the new factory up and running or you start communicating with them. And, it's very important in China, especially because it's built on relationships. And once a relationship is severed, especially if it's abruptly or rudely or without proper notification, it can be difficult to revive that relationship in China. And, in my experience, good relationships ensure that you can overcome problems quickly and effectively. And once that relationship is gone and that trust is gone, problems start to mount and become harder to solve, right? And so I would just say, bottom line, always make sure you have a reliable supplier throughout this transition process so that you can maintain continuity with your business. Okay. And then same with this in terms of, assuming that things are confidential. So don't assume that the supplier's not going to hear you leaving through the grapevine. And if they hear through the grapevine, this could cause tension. Quick story, I work with a company that quoted out a project with a new supplier, and this new supplier then reached out to their old supplier asking for quotes. And that's how the supplier heard about it. And it caused a lot of tension in the relationship afterwards. And they kept asking, are you guys planning on leaving us and moving? And, the answer was not clear. And that caused a lot of tension in the relationship. Additionally, don't assume that internal employees won't tell your supplier, given the relationships they've formed over the years. This happens more often than you think, whether it's a supplier coming in to visit you on site and starts engaging with different employees and asking questions, or through other modes of communication, whether that's through email or WhatsApp or WeChat or Signal. And, ensuring any kind of high-level moves are kept, internal until a transparent decision is made about what you guys want to do, right? Don't let rumors start. And if they do, address them quickly, because I've seen that, spiral out of control and, really dampen morale. So, doing this improperly, in terms of the communication, could include longer lead times with the supplier, sudden payment and change requests. We've seen that, reduced quality, breakdown in communications, degradation in service levels. There's a lot of things that can happen if the supplier feels that the communication is not on the up and up. So just bottom line, many employees have relationships with vendors due to years of working together, and might tip them off inadvertently or deliberately. And so make sure you're communicating internally on a need-to-know basis, and don't tell any other suppliers about the move until you need to, till you're for sure that you're going, or make sure that you have communication protocols in place to let them know when you are telling them something, who they can't tell, who they can tell, who they can reach out to, who they can't reach out to.
This cannot be stressed enough. My law firm has handled 2 hostage situations. We've handled a lot of hostage situations, actually, with involving factories, but 2 of them were when word got out that our client would be leaving a particular factory. And the factories were not doing well. This is 2 separate factories. I remember one very well because it was in Qingdao, where we used to have an office at one time. And the employees panicked that if our clients left these factories, that they would never get paid. So 2 of the people from our client went over there to check on progress on the products, and they were held hostage for weeks by the employees. Very similar circumstances in both instances. So yeah, it's important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oop. This one mine. 1 second. Let me get my.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so now as you go through this and you're now thinking about not only the factory that you're leaving, now let's think about the factory that you're moving to. And there's almost always underestimated the amount of time that new factory has to come up and get you quality product, right? We talked about it a little earlier about what the new factory is seeing for documents is often not what your current supplier is using. The new factory has to figure out the manufacturing process, the efficiencies, all the tips and tricks that your existing factory already knows. And often the sales team from your new factory will not tell you this. The sales team in the new factory will make you all kinds of promises on, we can be up and ready in X amount of months and X amount of weeks. Build in a healthy amount of skepticism for that, and build into your schedule a generous lead time based on what you experienced the first time this product went into production. Okay, consider it's a new build to your new factory, and consider it like a new build. If they do better than that, then that's great. You have inventory earlier, you have quality earlier, but don't build your whole project around the promises and the assumption that you're just going to move like to like, factory to factory, and it's going to start on day one. And we do see a lot of this assumption happening, right? As Andrew said, for sure, don't shut off that old supplier before this new supplier is up and running in a verified way, more than just their samples and more than their first or second shipment, right? You really want to make sure that that's a consistent process that you can manage. Yeah, I think that's it for this one. Just be very diligent about understanding the complexity of the manufacturing move. It's not just you're buying your widget from this factory to that factory, right? It's really a completely new build process.
I actually, surprisingly enough, see this a lot because clients will complain. They'll say, everyone acts like China doesn't have good quality, but we've got a 10% defect rate with this company, and in China it was 3%.
Yeah.
And I love reminding them by saying, well, but remember when you first went into China 15 years ago, you had about a 25% defect rate. It took you 15 years of working with them and training them to get them to 3%. You got to be patient. We're not going to sue them right now. So, I mean, people forget what China was like when they first went in. They're looking at it now.
Yeah. And that's especially if you're going from a Chinese factory that has like a ton of automation, right? And you may not understand that automation or normally care about the automation, but when you go to the new factory, do they have those same machines? Do they have that level of automation? Maybe not. So then it's a completely different manufacturing process that they're using to make your product, right?
Yeah, and notice a lot of factories don't have the same quantity or quality of tooling engineers or quality engineers or manufacturing engineers on staff. These people play a very important role in getting your line set up and running smoothly, and do a lot of things behind the scenes that you might not necessarily be involved with, you or your team, right? And that's a lot of knowledge, internal knowledge that is not transferable, that you have to see. Does this new factory have that ability?
I do see from companies that have their own factories in China and they're moving their own factory from country to country, right? Typically then you're going to have your staff in the old factory train the new factory, right? But different languages, different cultures, different written language, expensive to fly people all over the world and train. So even if you have an internal factory, just make sure that you are building all that into your project plan, right? Don't underestimate the complexity of this move.
Yeah. Okay, so we are now going to open up the comment.
Wait, we want one more.
No, I know that. I know there's another slide. We're about 5 minutes away from the Q&A. So we're opening it up, the chat channel, so people can pose their questions now. And please do so.
Great. Okay, so last mistake that we want you guys to avoid is minimizing transition inventory. Inventory, we know inventory is expensive. It eats up all your cash. This is not the time during a relocation that you want to be budget conscious around bringing your transition inventory down. This is the time to build up and cover any risk of the transition with good quality inventory that you're going to bleed down later after you bring in the new supplier. You may think this one might be, for some people, seem obvious that you're going to put in transition inventory, but we've been involved with projects, and especially projects that are technically complex, and the person leading the transition may not be from your inventory group. So the person is maybe your engineering head, and he's paying attention to molds and technical equipment moves. I was involved in a move where the engineer running the project really had maybe a week of inventory in between, because he had the schedule built so tight between the previous supplier and the new factory. And he really didn't think we needed any extra inventory. So it's an innocent thing on his part, but we absolutely had to build in extra stock to cover that and pull in sales to see what would be the sales variation during that time, to make sure that if we had a customer spike, we didn't immediately stock out during that period. So you may, at this point, not use finished good inventory to cover this. You might stock at a subassembly part, or you might stock, as Andrew said, as Dan was talking about, those special springs. Maybe you don't need the entire finished good inventory covered, but you want to buy a couple extra batches or a year's worth of your special component to cover that transition. So just look at that ahead of time before it's too late and you're out of stock for those things. And keep in mind, as Andrew said before, many of your components are coming from China and are so easy to get only because your factory has a relationship with that sub-tier supplier. Once you switch, that relationship isn't there anymore and that lead time extends. So plan transition inventory, and if you don't need it, you can bleed it down quickly and it covers you well.
Okay? Yeah. Just saying, just in time works when things are optimized. In a situation like this, I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Right? You can optimize your inventory levels after the transition has taken place and the new supplier has proven reliable and capable.
The other thing I just want to mention quickly is this is a good opportunity for your competition. If you are in a tight market and you're doing a transition and you're out of stock, that is the time for the competition to come in and grab your customers, right? And if they find out you're transitioning, then they're going to tell your customers. And nothing scares a customer like, I'm changing factories. What do you mean you're changing factories, right? What do you mean, will my new product be like my old product or not? So don't let them open that door, right? Cover the transition smoothly.
Great. I'm going to throw out a new topic that's not really related to this slide. I probably should have brought it up earlier. And I'm bringing it up now because number one, we promised it, and number two, it's probably on everyone's mind. And that's the issue of tariffs. And obviously, as lawyers, we're dealing a lot with tariffs these days. But I am seeing so many mistakes being made about tariffs and moves being made based on false assumptions and misinformation. And probably once every couple weeks, somebody will describe why they made a move based on a tariff, and I'll be listening to them and thinking they're just flat out wrong. I mean, we had a company, they got into a dispute with one of their two Chinese manufacturers. They went to their other Chinese manufacturer. That Chinese manufacturer said because of the dispute with the one, they couldn't stay in China. They didn't want to stay in China. So they went with that Chinese manufacturer to Cambodia. And Michelle talked about this a little earlier. A lot of times, these Chinese manufacturers in places like Cambodia, especially, even in Mexico, though, it's a Chinese product and it's still going to be tariffed like a Chinese product.
Yeah.
And people think that it's not, but it is. And if it's not, a lot of times something very illegal is happening. And Michelle referred a little bit earlier to transshipping. That is a very big risk. It's one of my favorite risks because our law firm represented 3 or 4 companies, and we went to the Department of Justice, and they got $64 million from the company that was lying about where their product was being made. And our clients got a decent chunk of that money. So you can't, determining your tariffs on your own is not a good idea, and making a move based on tariffs without knowing exactly what your tariffs really are, where you are, and what they will be where you go is a big mistake. And moving quickly because of the tariffs is as bad as moving quickly for any other reason.
Yeah. And to your point, I think now customs officials can request your bill of materials and make a determination to see where a lot of the components are coming from, and make that determination that if it is coming from China, whether you say it's being made in Vietnam or Mexico, right? If they determine a majority of those components are made in China, they could label your product made in China and, tariff you accordingly.
Right. And in today's New York Times, there's an article quoting customs saying we are going to crack down on all of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's happening like crazy right now.
Well, and the factories will promise factories are surprisingly willing to state the price incorrectly on your invoice. They are happy to mark shipments as gifts when they're not gifts. So, they'll make all kinds of promises and they'll do all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the person that's going to get, or the entity that's going to get fined and in trouble by the government is not the Chinese factory. It's going to be the recipient of the goods that accepted that, and that's you. So taking that risk is really not a smart thing to do these days.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. So, again, we've went over the 10 issues that we believe are some of the biggest pitfalls that companies face. And, just to kind of recap, tap into professionals like ourselves, at Harris, Sliwoski, Dan, Michelle, myself, we help clients like these avoid these problems regularly, right? Don't rush into any decision, as it can be incredibly costly to unwind. And, finally, just have a plan, anticipate the challenges, and have a strategy to address them if and when they do show up. And they most likely will show up. So, with that said, back to Dan for Q&A.
Okay. All right. Let me look here at some of these questions. Can your panel provide solutions or options for American companies to develop a strategic plan to consider factors or options to consider, leverage or mitigate losses in the event of tariff wars or political conflicts? I am going to interpret that question to mean, are there ways to figure out what the future is going to be in terms of tariffs and political conflicts? And there are ways. I've probably been asked 100 times when China's going to invade Taiwan. And I always say I've read everything on it and I have no idea. But that I shouldn't have picked that one, because there are certain ways. I mean, I always focus on Cambodia because Cambodia is viewed as a flunky of China. And so I always think that they're at long-term risk of being tariffed the way China is, because they don't really make much effort to not stamp made in China goods as made in Cambodia. So I view them as high risk. They're obviously low risk countries, Poland, let's say, but the lower the risk, the more expensive they are. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there are ways to figure it out, but it's difficult.
I'll say, I think that what can be helpful for companies is to do scenario planning with someone like Dan that knows what they're talking about, right? But to say, okay, based on our specific supply chain, our products, our regulations, right? Are you chemicals? Is it a medical product? What is it that you're manufacturing? Is to do some what if scenarios, okay? I mean, you mentioned Poland, and then the White House wants a 50% tariff on Europe, right? Starting June 1st. So right. Is that going to happen? How long is that going to happen for? Nobody knows this stuff, right? So we can't predict the future, but what you can do is scenario plan and say, what if this happens? What would be the effect on our products and our supply chain? What if this happens? And what would be the, right? And go through those scenarios. You need the time and the expertise to do all that. But if you do it, you should be able to come up with some worst case. The worst case scenario is if Cambodia gets taxed. The best case scenario is if Mexico, we think is the best opportunity. You should get at least some classifications of your risk that way. But I think predicting the future, no, especially with this administration that tends to decision make very quickly. They'll put something out, then they'll retract it, and they'll put something out and retract it. Very hard to anticipate.
Yeah. I think that regardless, there's going to be a baseline of tariffs. I don't think we're going to go back to the old days. I don't think Humpty Dumpty is being put back together again in that respect. The question is at what rate? Is it going to be that 50% or is it going to be more of a 10% baseline?
Yeah. Depending.
And I think it's going to be country specific or region specific. We'll have to see how that plays out. The recent UK deal that was just signed had, I think, a 10% baseline on the tariffs, and maybe that's what you can sort of factor in. But it's still too early, I think, to determine that.
Here's an interesting question. Is it really necessary to leave China?
Yeah.
Nope.
No. Yeah. I think for many.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it may be your absolute best move to stay. Yeah, maybe Andrew, you might want to say some more about that, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of industries that are simply, there is no alternative to China. Or like I said, take the glass industry, for example. Over 50% of all the glass jars that we see on store shelves, whether it's olives or peanut butter or jams or jellies, right? Those are all made in China because of the diversification of machinery and the type of machinery that they have. 50% of all that glass comes. And if you try to go to other countries, what you're going to find is, like I noted earlier, higher MOQs, longer lead times, right? Less value added services, right? If they can even slot you in, right? So for some companies in some industries, it's almost impossible for the next couple of years to find capacity outside of China that can meet your demands.
I will say you also might have an opportunity with your current suppliers if you stay, if everybody else is leaving. Like Andrew said, relationship is super important in China. If you are in, for example, someplace an industry that everybody's moving out and you're staying with your Chinese supplier and you fly over there and meet with them, you may be able to really cement an excellent relationship and get much better negotiations and quality than you've ever had before. And that will be recognized long-term, right? Because they are so relationship focused, right? You all of a sudden shoot to the number one on their customer list. So there are also opportunities of staying.
Yeah, absolutely. And using, strategic purchasing and procurement as a strategic lever to go ahead and continue that advantage where others might be leaving. So I think there's, for many industries, electronics, I mentioned glass, but electronics, very difficult to find a supplier outside. Even if you go to Vietnam, most of the upstream inputs and components are relying on China. Same with India, same with Malaysia. So, China is a practical solution now and for the next several years for many companies. There just simply isn't an alternative.
What is your opinion on Mexico as an alternative? And I'm going to answer this big picture and then turn it over to you for the smaller picture. When clients ask me about countries, I always make clear I'm not talking about their product. And I only talk about countries I know. And I know Mexico well. I very much like Mexico. I think the United States should have a good relationship with Mexico. If your production facility comes within the USCMA, I think that's the right abbreviation. I call it NAFTA too. It's easier that way. Then it's quite possible that you can get your products into the United States duty-free or tariff-free, I should say. And our clients who have moved their manufacturing to Mexico very much like it. They like the fact that it's a 2 or 3 hour flight. They like the workforce, on and on and on. But Mexico is not China. And it can be it really depends not just on your product, but on your company. If you're going to build a factory somewhere, Mexico can be great. If you're going to have something made for you via contract manufacturing, you might not be able to find anybody.
Yeah, totally agree. Excellent manufacturing in Mexico, easy to understand. The language issues are less, the culture issues are less. But the workforce is not the Chinese workforce. They don't have the numbers of China right? So often Mexican factories can struggle with turnover or training or getting the skilled trade. They just don't have the volume of the skilled workers that China has already developed. They don't have the automation levels necessarily, depending on the industry that you're in. But they'll get there. I mean, I've always been a fan of manufacturing in China. They also, you have to look at the percentage of labor that's in your product. Everybody, we talk a lot about, yes, but labor is cheaper, right? And you can do the comparisons on what people get paid by hour. But many companies don't look at the bill of materials and their routing and say, yes, but labor is only like 8% of my product cost. My product cost is all materials. And those materials themselves don't have a lot of labor in them. So you really have to look at what's the advantage of China for you? Is it not the labor, but it's the supply chain? Or is it, no, I have a very labor intensive process. And by moving to Mexico, then I'm going to take a cost hit. By doing that, my tariffs might be lower, but my costs will be higher. And this is our point back in the very first strategic question on why are you moving and what are you going to get out of that move? You may pay the exact same amount with tariffs from going to Mexico because of higher labor, but ultimately you're getting a much more resilient and flexible supply chain that's closer to home. So it could be worth it. So there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, I would add that I've had a few projects in Mexico, and I would say 80 to 90% of the raw materials were imported from China.
Yeah.
But there's significant transformation happening within Mexico. That's for certain. Yeah. But the tentacles of the supply chain extend deep into China for many of these products.
Yeah, and Chinese manufacturers are opening companies in Mexico like crazy, right? So often when you talk to your Chinese supplier and say, I want to get out of China, they might say to you, no problem. We have 3 factories in Mexico. Would you like to visit them? Right? Yeah. So more and more, if you're doing it for a patriotic reason and you just want to exit China, this is much more difficult than it looks to begin with. Yeah.
One of the things that we've been dealing with respect to Mexico is working with our clients to reduce the China content to the point where their product is actually made in Mexico for tariff purposes rather than made in China. And a lot of companies make the move to Mexico, and this makes complete sense, knowing that the first year or so, their product will probably be deemed to be made in China. But during that year, they're working on sourcing springs or whatever from Mexico so they can reach the point where it is actually can be deemed made in Mexico for U.S. tariff purposes. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to selfishly grab a legal one. It says, with nearshoring gaining momentum across Latin America and the Caribbean, what are some of the most common legal or operational blind spots companies face, particularly around IP protection, labor law compliance, or dispute resolution? Are there specific risks? Well, I think the question does actually a pretty good job of answering itself. And what's interesting about manufacturing is that the basics, the core issues, and the core legal issues are going to be the same, whether it's Mexico, Portugal, Colombia, Vietnam, etc. You do want to protect your IP. Generally, that means with contracts, that means with registrations. You are going to, if you're hiring people, you're going to have to deal with the employment issues, which can be brutal in a lot of countries. I don't think there's a country easier than the United States for that. And then dispute resolution, that's one of my favorite topics. That's something that you need to deal with in your contracts. And that varies by country. I mean, there are some countries where you want to have your lawsuit in, others you don't. Sometimes it's arbitration. Sometimes it deals with one of the things that we often do in choosing what laws should apply and what countries should apply is we look at what is the absolute worst thing that can happen to our client and where would we like that issue resolved. Because sometimes you need an injunction, some countries don't give them. So these are the issues that you're going to need to deal with if you're moving to a new country, and you're going to need to deal with them like you did in your old country, be that China or whatever. Our time is up. I'm sorry we did not get to all of your questions. Maybe we'll do a follow-up. If there's enough interest, we'll do a follow-up webinar, or we'll just answer your questions online somewhere, maybe attached with this, because we will be rebroadcasting this in various places. So thank you, everyone, for attending, and good luck.
Thanks.